He was a king feared by all, not just his enemies, but his own family. Even the terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, ruled with iron and blood. But in one tragic moment of uncontrollable rage, he did the unthinkable. He murdered his own son, the heir to his throne. Was it madness, a fatal accident, or the final act of a ruler consumed by paranoia? This is not just a tale of royal bloodshed. It's the chilling unraveling of a father, a son, and an empire doomed by violence. And it all began with a scream in the palace. Chapter 1. The Boy in the Frozen Palace. He was born into silence and raised by shadows. When Ivan IV came into the world in 1530, he did not yet wear the name that history would curse him by. He was not yet the terrible, not yet a Tsar. He was merely a child, fragile, wide-eyed, and destined to inherit a kingdom soaked in betrayal. From the very start, fate played a cruel hand. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, was a strict ruler but a cautious one, working tirelessly to preserve the Rurik dynasty. But death does not wait for ambition. When Vasily succumbed to infection and died, Ivan was just 3 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, a sharp-witted noblewoman of Serbian descent, tried to hold the regency. She fought like a lioness for her son, fending off the greedy boyars, those aristocrats who prowled the court, hungry for influence and gold. But Elena would not last. One morning she was found lifeless in her chambers, her face frozen in agony, her skin already gray. Rumors whispered through the corridors like smoke. Poison, treachery. The boyars had struck. There would be no justice. Left without parents, Ivan and his younger brother Yuri were placed under the care of the very nobles who had likely murdered their mother. They didn't raise him, they managed him like a dangerous animal. Servants were whipped in front of the young prince. Food was rationed, even stolen. His cries went unanswered. And so he stopped crying. He watched and remembered. The boyars drank in golden goblets, feasted on meats roasted over open flames, and laughed in circles of whispered schemes. Ivan, a child in silk slippers, wandered the cold halls like a ghost, observing every slight, every act of cruelty. He fed scraps to dogs beneath the table and listened as the nobles plotted their futures, never once imagining that the silent child beside the hearth would grow up to destroy them all. By the time he was 7, Ivan had learned the language of power. He knew its rhythm, the way it crackled in voice, glimmered in jewelry, turned men into monsters. He learned too that love was a weakness the powerful could not afford. There was no love for him, no warmth, only contempt and control. He began to assert himself in small, terrifying ways. When no one was watching, he'd torment small animals, rip pages from sacred books, steal candles to watch them melt. The acts were not malicious but experiments, exercises in dominion. If no one would love him, then he would teach them to fear him. At age 16, the boy became a man, and then a monarch. The coronation was unlike anything Russia had seen before. Ivan did not merely take the title of Grand Prince. He crowned himself Tsar, Caesar, Emperor. No one had ever dared assume such a title. It was not just a declaration of rule, it was a declaration of destiny. He was not a servant of God, he was chosen by God. The crown was not a symbol, it was armor. And for a time the armor held. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a gentle noblewoman whose compassion softened the harsh edges of his soul. With her by his side, Ivan was calmer, even noble. He established a council of advisors, reformed military ranks, began fairer tax policies. He built St. Basil's Cathedral, not just to glorify God, but to show Russia he could build beauty, not just terror. People began to hope, but peace is fragile in the hearts of wounded kings. In 1560, Anastasia fell ill. Fever consumed her, weakening her day by day. Even summoned doctors from across Europe, mystics from Asia, monks from mountaintops. Nothing worked. She died slowly, painfully in his arms. In her final hours, Ivan wept, not as a czar, but as a broken man. When her heart stopped, so too did his reason. He blamed the Boyars. He was certain they had poisoned her, just as they had poisoned his mother. The circle had repeated, the mask shattered. What emerged was not Ivan the ruler, but Ivan the destroyer. His grief fermented into paranoia, and paranoia fermented into rage. He formed the Oprichnina, a secret police force loyal only to him. They wore black, rode black horses, and carried dog heads on their saddles as symbols of their master's vigilance. They were hounds of war, tearing through villages, burning estates, executing entire families without trial. The Tsar no longer ruled from a throne. He ruled from fear. Thousands died, clergy, nobles, peasants. The rivers of Russia ran red. But amid the carnage, a boy was growing. A boy with his father's fire, but his mother's calm. His name was Ivan Ivanovich. He was the Tsar's son, and perhaps the only person in Russia who could speak truth to the madman. Brave, disciplined, and loyal, the younger Ivan fought in wars, negotiated treaties, and carried himself with honor. To the people, he was a beacon. To the Tsar, he was a threat. There was love between father and son, but also unease. The son questioned the terror sweeping the land. He urged moderation, compassion, mercy. But these were foreign tongues to the Tsar. He saw disobedience, rebellion, betrayal. The same ghosts that haunted him as a boy now whispered about his own flesh and blood. One afternoon, as snow dusted the spires of the Alexandrov Kremlin, a servant entered the palace trembling. He bore news. The Tsarevich had argued with his father again about a military campaign, about the people starving in Novgorod, about a woman. The Tsar's eyes darkened. The ghosts were whispering again. And in that moment, the fate of a nation turned toward its doom. But that, as the chroniclers say, belongs to another night. Chapter 2, The Blow That Killed an Empire. Snow drifted through the towers of Alexandrov Palace like silent ghosts, settling on rooftops that had once shimmered with imperial glory. The air was bitter, thick with frost and foreboding. Inside the royal chambers, the scent of wax, iron, and incense hung in the air, a smell that clung to war and mourning alike. Ivan the Terrible sat hunched on his throne, finger wrapped around the golden scepter he never went anywhere without. His back was bent with age, but his eyes burned, feverish, restless, alive with suspicion. The past for Ivan had never died. It whispered to him in dreams. It slithered into his waking thoughts. His mother's lifeless face, his wife's final breath, the blood of boyars on polished marble floors. They all haunted him, a choir of ghosts in royal robes. And now the whispers carried a new voice. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, the Tsarevich, had grown into a lion of a man. With his strong chin and confident gaze, he looked every bit the ruler that Ivan had once hoped to be. The people adored him. The soldiers followed him. Even the foreign court spoke his name with curiosity and admiration. But to Ivan the Terrible, admiration was a double-edged blade. It meant independence. It meant disobedience. It meant danger. The quarrels had grown more frequent. Heated discussions over military decisions, over the treatment of peasants, over the Oprichnina's endless bloodletting. But it wasn't just politics that fueled the fire. It was pride. One day in late autumn, the court fell into a hush. A rumor swept the palace like wildfire. Ivan had struck his pregnant daughter-in-law. The young woman, beautiful and proud, had been caught wearing what the Tsar considered immodest clothing, a thin gown not befitting her station. He accused her of corruption, of shame, of disgrace. And when she protested, when she dared speak back, he lashed out. A blow to the abdomen. The child she carried, Ivan's grandchild, was lost that same night. The Tsarevich stormed into the chamber like a thunderclap, his face red with fury. He screamed at his father, cursed him, accused him of madness, of cruelty, of murder. And for the first time in years, someone spoke to Ivan the Terrible like a man, not a god. What followed was silence. The kind of silence that stretches seconds into eternities. And then, the scream. It came from the Tsar's own lips, a primal, wounded cry, and his hand moved with terrifying speed. The golden scepter, heavy and jeweled, swung through the air in an arc of rage and desperation. It struck his son directly on the skull. The sound, a sickening crack, echoed through the chamber. The Tsarevich staggered backward. His hands reached for the wound, blood already seeping through his fingers. For a moment, he looked less like a prince and more like a broken child. Then he collapsed. Time stopped. Ivan stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth trembling. The scepter slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor with a metallic ring. "No, no," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside the body. "My son, my boy." He cradled the Tsarevich's head in his lap, pressing trembling hand to the bleeding gash. He screamed for doctors, for priests, for God himself. But it was too late. The young man did not die immediately. He lingered for hours, perhaps even days, delirious, feverish, his words slurred and confused. At times he called for his mother. At others, he looked into his father's eyes and asked simply, "Why?" There was no answer, only tears. Ivan wept as he had never wept before, not for his murdered enemies, not for Anastasia, but for the son he had destroyed. In those final hours, the Tsar never left his side. He muttered prayers, made promises to saints he barely believed in, offered gold, power, even his own life, anything to reverse what had been done. But destiny is deaf to the cries of kings. When the Tsarevich finally died, Ivan's scream shook the palace. Servants fled. The Oprichniki lowered their heads. In that moment, the most feared man in Russia was reduced to a father, cradling his own tragedy. News of the death spread like fire through Moscow. The heir was gone. The people mourned not just a man, but a future. For with Ivan Ivanovich died the last hope of a just and stable rule. What remained was chaos, and a broken Tsar spiraling into madness. Even the Terrible was never the same. He ordered grand memorials. He fasted for days. He beat his chest until it bruised and bled. But no act of penance could undo what his fury had wrought. Worse still, his remaining son, Fyodor, was weak in both body and mind. He was pious, yes, gentle even, but utterly unfit to rule. A child with a crown, a lamb among wolves. And so, when Ivan the Terrible finally died in 1584, collapsed during a game of chess, some say poisoned, others say cursed, Russia was left in the hands of a boy who could not lead. The time of troubles began. Years of famine, civil war, foreign invasion. The dynasty teetered on the brink of extinction, and at its root, buried beneath the snow and the sorrow, lay the ghost of a son murdered by his own father. Pain begets pain. Tyranny begets ruin. And history, ever the coldest witness, remembers. They say Ivan's ghost still wanders the halls of Alexandrov Palace, that his scream can still be heard in the dead of winter, when the wind howls like wolves and the candles flicker for no reason, that he still clutches the scepter that killed his son, his eyes wild, searching for forgiveness in a world that long stopped listening. But no monument can redeem a legacy carved in blood. No church bell can drown the sound of a father's fatal blow. And no crown, no matter how divine, can shield a man from the weight of his own sins. Chapter 3. The Crown Without an Heir. The room still echoed with silence. Days had passed since the scream, the one that tore through stone walls and palace gates, the one that would haunt Russia for centuries. And yet, silence lingered. Not the kind that brings peace, the kind that follows after something sacred has been broken. Ivan the Terrible no longer spoke to his ministers. He no longer roamed the halls like a predator, nor barked orders with the fury of a god-king. He simply existed. A shadow, a ghost, a father who had destroyed his own flesh and blood. In the great cathedral, they placed Ivan Ivanovich in a tomb of silver and oak. The people wept openly in the streets. Men who had once feared the Tsar now cursed his name. Women tore at their hair. Priests lit candles that burned for days. And even the stone statues seemed to mourn. For with the death of the Tsarevich, the crown had lost its only future. The boy who remained, Fyodor, was delicate, withdrawn, and slow of thought. He could recite every psalm in the Orthodox Bible by heart, but he could not hold a sword. He could not command. He could not rule. The court knew it. The nobles knew it. And Ivan knew it. In the final years of his reign, the Tsar seemed to deteriorate from the inside. His body, once powerful and broad-shouldered, grew thin, sickly. He complained of aches in the bones, of visions in the dark, of voices that spoke to him when the candles were low. Some said he had been cursed by the very saints he had prayed to. Others whispered that his madness had finally eaten through what little was left of his soul. One servant claimed to see him standing before the mirror at dawn, staring into his own reflection and muttering, "What have you done?" over and over again. Still, the machine of state continued to grind forward. Executions continued. Taxes mounted. And the land, weary and blood-soaked, groaned beneath the weight of a king who no longer ruled with purpose, but with pain. In 1584, as snow melted into muddy spring, Ivan the Terrible collapsed during a game of chess. His guards rushed in. His advisors hovered like crows. But it was over. The man who had crowned himself Tsar, who had murdered his rivals, his people, and his own son, lay lifeless on the cold floor. His hand still gripped the black bishop piece. The room was silent. Some say he was poisoned by courtiers desperate to end his madness. Others believe his heart simply gave out from decades of rage. Whatever the truth, Ivan IV had died as he had lived, surrounded by fear, alone. But the terror was far from over. The time of troubles begins with Ivan's death. The crown passed to Fyodor I, a man more monk than monarch. Gentle, pious, and deeply religious, Fyodor loved bells, birds, and prayer. He had no taste for war, no mind for politics, and no understanding of power. The real ruler behind the throne became Boris Godunov, Fyodor's brother-in-law, a cunning courtier who had survived Ivan's purges and knew how to pull strings without being seen. But even Boris couldn't hide the cracks. Russia was falling apart. Peasant revolts flared across the countryside. Famine stalked the land, its skeletal fingers reaching into every hut and hovel. Entire villages vanished, starved, frozen, or slaughtered. Nobles turned on each other. Bandits ruled the roads. Foreign powers, Poland, Sweden, hovered like vultures above a dying beast. And worst of all, the people began to whisper of a miracle, a legend, a ghost, the return of the Tsarevich. In the southern provinces, a rumor began to take shape. The Tsarevich Ivan had survived. He had not died from his father's blow, they said, but had been smuggled away in secret, raised in exile, hidden by loyalists. Now he was returning to claim the throne that was rightfully his. It was nonsense, a fantasy. But in a land suffocating from starvation and sorrow, fantasy was oxygen. The man who emerged from the shadows was no prince. His name was Grigory Otrepyev, a defrocked monk with ambition like fire in his blood. He dressed in royal colors. He mimicked Ivan's speech. He claimed to be the murdered son, returned from the grave, and Russia believed him. They called him the false Dmitri, though some claimed he was another lost son of Ivan. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he promised something the people hadn't felt in years: hope. He rallied an army, peasants, deserters, even Polish mercenaries. He marched north toward Moscow, and incredibly, he won. In 1605, the impostor sat upon the throne. For a few short months, he was Tsar. He ordered reforms. He pardoned rebels. He married a Polish princess. But the court, ever a nest of knives, turned on him. The boyars dragged him from his bed, threw his body from a window, and paraded his corpse through the streets. His remains were burned, his ashes shot from a cannon toward the west. But it was too late. The floodgates had broken. More false Dimitris emerged, each claiming blood, each sowing chaos. Poland invaded. Sweden followed. Famine deepened. Towns turned into battlegrounds. The Orthodox Church was torn in half. For nearly 15 years, Russia was without order, without stability, without a future. All because one man, one father, had let his rage kill his son. A legacy of ashes. By 1613, the land was nearly lost. But in the darkness, a new family rose to power, the Romanovs. With support from the clergy, nobility, and what remained of the military, they crowned Michael Romanov, a boy of just 16, as Tsar. His coronation ended the time of troubles, but the scars remained. Even the terrible's bloodline had ended. His dynasty died with the son he murdered. What followed was not justice, but survival. The Romanovs would rule Russia for the next 300 years, but they would always do so under the long, cold shadow of the man who had burned his legacy to the ground. The scream that never fades. Centuries later, a Russian painter named Ilya Repin stood before a canvas. He had read the stories. He had felt the chill in the archives, the madness in the texts, and he had imagined the moment that changed everything. The instant the scepter fell, the skull cracked, and the future died. Repin's painting, Even the Terrible and His Son, depicts the Tsar cradling his bleeding boy, eyes wide with horror, mouth twisted in agony. It caused uproar. The government tried to ban it, but it endured. Because some wounds do not heal, some screams do not fade, and some stories must be told again and again, so we never forget what power unchecked truly becomes. Chapter 4. The Spider in the Web. The crown sat uneasy upon the boy's brow. Fyodor Thremir, son of Ivan the Terrible, ruled in name only. Though he wore the imperial robes and bowed his head before holy icons, it was clear to all that the real master of Russia stood quietly behind the throne, Boris Godunov. He was a man of many faces. To the clergy, he was pious. To the nobles, he was clever. To the peasants, he was invisible. But beneath his calm exterior lay a mind sharp as glass and twice as deadly. He had survived the madness of Ivan's court by mastering the art of silence, knowing when to speak and when to disappear. While others perished in purges, Boris rose like smoke from a burning palace. Now he ruled from the shadows. As Tsar Fyodor prayed and wept over holy scriptures, Boris issued commands. It was he who secured treaties, moved armies, and silenced dissent. No decision passed without his blessing. And when the weak Tsar finally died in 1598, childless, forgotten, it was Boris who stepped forward, crown in hand. Russia had no heir, no dynasty, no future. And so, for the first time in its history, the nation crowned a man not born of royal blood, but of ambition. A new Tsar, an old curse. The coronation of Boris Godunov was a lavish affair, desperate in its grandeur, as if silk and incense could erase the memory of blood. Gold flooded the cathedrals. Bells rang for days. Yet beneath the pageantry lay dread. The people whispered, "Ivan's ghost walks still." And indeed it seemed true. Crops failed. Winters stretched unnaturally long. Plagues returned to the countryside. Entire provinces withered. Boris blamed bad luck. The church blamed sin. The peasants blamed the curse. A Tsar who had murdered his son had broken the divine chain. Every disaster was a judgment. But Boris did not believe in curses. He believed in control. He tightened his grip, expanded surveillance, sent spies into monasteries, into merchant homes, even into noble bedrooms. Suspected conspirators were strangled in their sleep, their estates seized, their names erased from the chronicles. Still, unrest grew, and from across the western border came the echo of a lie that refused to die. The phantom heir returns. Another Dmitri had appeared, another son of Ivan the Terrible, claiming to have survived his father's wrath. But this one, tall, charismatic, and backed by Polish money, was far more dangerous. His eyes burned with fanatic purpose. He preached not only of royal right, but of vengeance. He promised land to peasants, power to Cossacks, and retribution to boyars. He painted Boris not as a protector, but as a usurper, a murderer, a devil in a bishop's robe. People listened, desperate for food, justice, a savior. They rose up. Peasants armed with pitchforks, priests with smuggled letters, soldiers weary of fighting for shadows. By 1605, the rebellion had reached the gates of Moscow. Boris Godunov stood in his chambers, staring out over the frozen city. His face, once unreadable, now wore deep cracks of worry. He clutched a letter in his hand, a list of nobles, former allies, who had sworn allegiance to the false Dmitri. And then, as if guided by some bitter fate, Boris collapsed. A heart attack, they said, a divine punishment, others whispered. The Tsar of Shadows was gone, and Russia once again stood upon the edge of the abyss. The impostor's crown. The false Dmitri entered Moscow in triumph, the streets flooded with people. He was greeted as a returned son, a messiah, a hero. He married a Polish noblewoman, converted secretly to Catholicism, and began rewarding his backers with Russian titles. But glory does not survive long in the court of betrayal. The Orthodox Church turned against him. The boyars, once again, plotted behind velvet curtains. And 1 year later, in 1606, they struck. The false Dmitri was dragged from his palace, his body mutilated, his corpse desecrated, another Tsar dead, another dream devoured by the wolves of politics, a nation without a soul. The next years were chaos. Tsars rose and fell like coins tossed into a well. A second false Dmitri appeared, then a third. Swedish and Polish armies occupied Russian soil. Noble houses built private armies. Whole cities declared independence. And the people, those caught in the middle, starved, wept, and died by the thousands. This was not a kingdom. It was a corpse wearing a crown. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible had not ended with his death. It had metastasized. His paranoia infected every throne. His violence echoed in every purge. His fear of betrayal became prophecy again and again. What he had unleashed was no longer a dynasty or even an empire. It was a sickness. The boy from the monastery. Then from the ashes came something unexpected. Not a prince, not a general, a boy. Michael Romanov, 16 years old, quiet, deeply religious. The last surviving heir of a noble house that had once served the Tsars. He had spent most of his life in a monastery, far from court intrigues. He had no army, no fortune, no claim, but he had something no other candidate possessed, a clean name. And so, in 1613, the clergy, the nobles, and the remnants of a broken people met. and they crowned him Tsar. It was not triumph, it was surrender, a prayer cast into the ruins. And the ghost still watches. Michael Romanov would begin a dynasty that lasted 300 years. He would restore order, reforge alliances, rebuild the state. But even as his rule stabilized the realm, one truth remained unspoken in the palace halls. They were all still living in Ivan's shadow. Because power born in blood never truly dies. It lingers, like a scream caught in stone, like a scepter still stained with the blood of a prince, like a painting, one man, one boy, and a mistake so monstrous it doomed an empire. Chapter 5, The Blood That Never Dried. The room was still, not with peace, but with the kind of stillness that comes after screaming, the kind of silence that fills a space only when there's no one left to cry. Years had passed, decades, centuries, and yet the floor beneath the throne at Alexandrov still bore the scar, a faint, dark stain soaked into the wood, too deep for time or cleansing to erase. Blood, the blood of a prince, the blood of a future, the blood of a son killed by his father. They tried to rewrite it, of course, the court historians, the church, even the czars who came after. They called it an accident, a tragedy, a moment of madness. But the people remembered. They always remembered. Because that blow, that golden scepter crashing down on bone and crown, did not just kill a man, it broke a lineage. It cursed a nation. It silenced the only voice that could have saved Russia from the monster it had crowned. Even the terrible died, yes. His bones turned to dust beneath cathedrals. His palaces crumbled. His statues were razed, then torn down. But his legacy, it lingered like a disease in the bloodstream of an empire. Boris Godunov ruled in his name. False heirs rose, claiming to be his sons. Wars were fought in his shadow. Famines blamed on his wrath. Even the time of troubles, a chaos so wide it swallowed whole generations, was, in truth, the long echo of a scream let loose when Ivan struck his boy. There is a painting. You've seen it. Two figures locked in an embrace that is neither love nor mercy. The older man's eyes are wide, terrified, hollow, mad with grief. His hands press against the temple of the dying boy, as if trying to hold his soul inside his skull. Blood trickles between his fingers. The boy's gaze is distant, already fading, but his lips are parted. Mid-question, perhaps, or mid-forgiveness. The painting is not history. It is memory. It is guilt, brush-stroked into eternity. Ilya Repin, the artist, said the image came to him in a nightmare. And perhaps that's the only place it could have come from. Because to look upon that canvas is to understand the unspeakable. That a king, blessed by the church, crowned by God, feared by the world, could fall so deep into fear and rage that he would raise his hand not against an enemy, but against his own blood. And for what? For pride? For paranoia? For a phantom whisper in the dark? We like to believe that kings are different, that rulers carry wisdom, that crowns bestow clarity. But Ivan was not a king. He was a boy who grew up in fear and learned to rule through pain. He was a child who watched his mother poisoned, who was beaten by nobles, abandoned by love, fed by fury. And when he finally took power, he did not lead, he avenged. Against the world, against the court, against fate itself. But vengeance has no end. It only circles back, and in the end, it took from him the only thing he had left, his son. Some say that in his final days, Ivan refused to be alone. He would summon guards, servants, even beggars, just to fill the air with breathing. Others claimed he slept in his armor, fearful of dreams, that every night he heard his son's voice asking that same question. Why? No one knows what Ivan said in reply. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. But what we do know is this: when a father kills a son, the kingdom dies with him. The Romanovs would rule for centuries after. They would expand Russia, modernize it, baptize it in war and revolution. But they would never truly escape the shadow of that blood stain on the palace floor. Because some blood never dries, some screams never fade, and some thrones, no matter how high, are built not on stone or gold, but on bones. So remember this, when you hear tales of great rulers and mighty empires, power does not make gods. It only reveals monsters. And sometimes the deadliest monster wears a crown. Personal reflections on the tragedy of Ivan the Terrible and his son. The story of Ivan the Terrible and the death of his son is, to me, more than a royal tragedy. It is a chilling reminder of how unchecked power, when rooted in fear and trauma, can become monstrously self-destructive. Ivan was not born a tyrant. He was shaped by abandonment, betrayal, and a childhood stripped of love. What we often call madness in history is sometimes just the accumulation of unhealed wounds. What's haunting is not just that Ivan killed his son, but that he loved him. That love, twisted by paranoia, turned to rage. And that rage, when paired with absolute power, had nowhere to go but inward, toward the very bloodline he once sought to preserve. It's the ultimate irony. In trying to protect his throne, Ivan destroyed the only person who could have continued it. This story also forces us to look at how history repeats itself through silence. The court enabled Ivan's violence. The church sanctified it. And when the price was paid, it was not only the family that suffered, but an entire nation. The time of troubles wasn't just a political collapse. It was the emotional aftermath of a dynasty devouring itself. In the end, this isn't just about Russia or royalty. It's about what happens when men are taught that power is everything, but healing is weakness. When fear is passed from father to son like a crown. It is a cautionary tale that still speaks today, in politics, in families, in every place where unchecked power meets unresolved pain. Some legacies are not built in glory but in grief, and some thrones are too heavy to carry alone.